Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 51. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host today, Jeb Card. And today we're talking about the Hexham heads. What are these creepy little stone heads? And what do they have to do with Were-Sheep Man and spectral werewolves? Get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I am here today with Jeb. How's it going?
Okay, I have decided to start recording at least occasionally from my home, which means I am surrounded by my library of strange and unusual occult books and artifacts. So here we go.
So you joined Ken and I in recording out of your back room while your animals scratch desperately at your door?
No, that would be at school, and by animals we mean my students. No, I would never say that. They are very good students. I am actually teaching high school students this summer, and they are fantastic. They have had so many good questions for me. We're way behind in what I want to cover, and it's really a joy. I had them do this exercise where they actually decipher, like they figure out what Egyptian hieroglyphs, specific ones mean, and they kicked the crap out of it today. So
that's cool.
I'm actually
I love
in a very
working
good
with kids.
I'm in a very, well, I mean high school kids. So like 15,
They're
16.
still kids.
Yeah.
I know they don't like to think that, but they're still kids.
No, but they're like 2 years younger than some of the ones I had last summer will be in my courses this fall, like some of the specific ones.
The great thing about teaching high school kids is like they're still kid enough that you can goof around, but they're like smart enough that they can do things.
Oh yeah.
So it's like that perfect combo where they're still fun. In
addition to getting paid, it's actually one of the reasons why I do the summer scholar thing, because they're really great to work with. And also, they're the kind of kids, I mean, they're all great and they have their own, but at the same time, one of the summer camp things they're doing is to go to college. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah,
so I enjoy working with them, and I've got like 2 days left with them. It's like 6 hours a day and I'm almost done. So that's great. So anyway, I think we're here to talk about something a little stranger than Egyptian hieroglyphs today, though.
We are, and actually, this is something that I was not aware of until Jeb brought it up to me, and it's
my fault. It is my fault.
This is Jeb's fault. And the funny part about these vanished the same year I was born.
Oh, really?
So I may be a reincarnated Hexham head.
Oh God, that's a terrifying thought. Which I think, I'm going to spoil it right now, means you might be a were-sheep. Yes, I just said it. A were-sheep.
I may be man, sheep, wolf.
This is the quality that I bring to this podcast. So yes.
It explains my strange cravings for grass on full moon nights.
There are so many things that one could do with that utterance. All right. So yes, we're going to talk about the Hexham heads and I think some related topics, because like many of the things we talk about, archaeology is all about context. Well, so are a lot of these things. And I think as we've been getting at with some of our recent podcasts, these ideas these cases, they're not just the case of the Hexham heads, although that's kind of fun to say. They are in larger cultural contexts and historical contexts. And I think we're going to hit some of that here.
Yeah, let's give the history of the story of the Hexham heads themselves before we start delving into the things that are associated with said heads, because
before we wax theoretic.
Right, because some of these things are not apparent from the story or the heads themselves. So when we're talking about the Hexham heads, we're talking about two small stones.
Although we'll talk about what exactly that means.
That's misleading. But they are described as being anywhere between the size of a tennis ball to a small tangerine.
Yeah, about a cue ball was one of the descriptions I heard. Now, by the way, I'm just going to put this right out here. While there are a couple of sources that we're going to be using, and so I'm just going to say them now. Probably the two most important sources on this, unless you really get into the weeds. This is one of the first places it talked about, has about like, I think 6 or 8 pages on, if I remember correctly. David Clark with Andy Roberts, Twilight of the Celtic Gods, an exploration of Britain's hidden pagan traditions. This is from the 1980s and it is I think it's the 1980s. I'll double check it right now because I have it here because I'm at home with all my occult books.
Well, and I'll be putting everything in the show notes too.
1996, excuse me. So this is a mid-1990s sort of take on a lot of the kind of topics we talk about, but it's specifically in a UK context. And even if you don't believe everything that they cover, and they are like respected archaeology background journalists, et cetera, it is friggin' fascinating. I cannot recommend like perusing this book enough. It is very interesting. But where we're getting most of our data is from Paul Screeton, also a journalist, Quest for the Hexham Heads. Now, I have not seen his movie Heads, ! It is online. I should see it at some point. But this book that he wrote in, I want to say it's 2010, is pretty much the definitive sort of take on all the data. It's a little meandering, partly because Screeton was involved when these things were going on in the 1970s. Yeah, he talks about it. So I just want to get that out of the way. We may reference some other things, but clearly we're getting a lot of information from those two sources. So
well, and
I just want to be fair about it.
The Hexham Heads are really interesting because I think they're the most recent thing that we've ever dealt with on here, being that they were, I want to say, rediscovered-ish in the early 1970s. So that's, I think, the most recent thing we've looked at so far.
Well, I mean, we've talked about some ideas that are more recent, like
right, but this isn't an idea. This is these were legitimate artifacts.
Right. So they are found by, well, as it goes, and this all gets very sketchy. I don't mean like in a negative way, but like in a, we don't, like even the people that very much believe in this or are skeptical, like what days, what specific things, how deep were they found? All this starts to get a little loose. But from basically more or less in 1971, 2 young to teenage boys, or I think younger than that, a little younger than that, Colin and Leslie Robson in 1971.
They were 11. One of the sources I saw said the boys were 11 and they were helping their mother read.
They're different ages, but like it's about there. Yes.
Yeah, it's around 11.
Yeah. So they find in the garden. So they're living in Hexham in northern England, the town of Hexham, and they find in the backyard of their house in the garden 2 stone, and we'll get back to that, heads. They're really crude looking. There are some pictures of them, and there are even archaeological like stippling drawings of them because they were published by a local museum. So there is actual information on them. They don't exist now. I mean, if they do, who knows where? But they find these things, and they're written up. But that's not the important part. There's basically 2 strands here. 1, what people thought they were, and 2, what people said happened around them.
Right. And the objects themselves. So let's just focus on the objects themselves now. So, you know, we said that there's 2 small stone-looking heads pulled out of the backyard that these 2 boys had found. And
very crude faces.
Very crude faces. They kind of look like, one of them looks like an apple doll that's been dried up, if anyone's ever seen an apple doll. The other one...
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, the other one kind of is just very bland looking.
Yeah.
I'm looking at a picture of them, obviously.
Right. And one does have like hair, like lines.
Yeah, like lines carved in it for hair.
Yeah.
When I first saw the pictures of them, I thought they looked like doll heads, like heads that had fallen off a doll. Because when you're doing field investigation, you find all kinds of weird shit out of context.
And we'll come back to that. Like, that's a very important observation. We will come back to the fact that they look a lot like dolls.
Yeah, and they look a lot like a head from like from a doll that has been disassociated from the cloth body. But
they're made of a rough stone.
They are. They're made of some kind of stone that has been described as sandstone. But again, we're burying the lead for the time being. So what I like about this is that these heads from the sounds of it, they were turned over to the quote unquote authorities pretty quickly after being discovered.
Yes, like a local antiquarian museum, or like a local museum. Yeah.
Keeping in mind that the reason this probably happened is not because of the Good Samaritanness of the people overseas. Technically, in England, I believe all archaeological artifacts belong to the crown. So if you find something and you keep it, are you breaking the law then?
I'd have to get into I'd have to get into the weeds, but the treasure trove gets really weird that way because it becomes a matter of the people intend to come back for it or they didn't. I think it's turned over, but what they didn't do is they didn't go like to the press freaking out like I found like this wonderful, amazing, like I found Bigfoot's skull. Right. No, that comes, but it's only after other things happen.
Right. And so the heads are turned over to the authorities, which gets them sent to a local university.
Yep.
And gets them into hands of a actual archaeologist pretty quickly, which is
good. They go to the Newcastle Museum of Antiquities.
Right. And they are...
And then they go to Southampton University, and we'll come back to that.
Right. Who gets a hold of them first when they're at Newcastle?
I have some names. I have one, Douglas Robson, but then even the wiki had that as a different name, but I think that's correct. But some people look at it. There. It's Frank Hodson, and then we'll talk about Anne Ross at Southampton.
Yeah, Anne Ross is a big player in this story.
And she's a huge player. She's basically the center of it.
Yeah, and she has quite a bit of analysis done on the heads and does quite a bit of writing on them herself, which is nice because it actually gets the heads examined early. As if they were actual artifacts. Right. So they're being treated like an archaeological recovery.
Now, Anne Ross, and I've actually not read, but like perused, like I didn't sit down and read it line by line, but I looked through her book that was published some years before this, but not a lot of years before this, on Celtic art. She was a well-renowned Celtic art historian and archaeologist, and she was I think this is correct, the biggest champion of the idea of a Celtic cult of the head. There was, from historical records and folklore and possibly archaeological finds, this idea that amongst Celtic peoples, and we'll come back to that possibly, that they would decapitate people and keep heads around and skulls around for various ritual reasons. And so she was collecting at this time a number. She had a whole collection of quote unquote Celtic heads, some others of which also had some unusual judgments on them as well, although I can't really talk about that much, but that's my understanding.
Oh, yeah, and see, this is where one of my first like big questions come up, is this whole cult of the head thing that is mentioned several times in association with Anne Ross, and I'm just like, what was it? You kind of clarified that a little bit. The heads that she supposedly have are all stone, though, right?
Yes, but there is also the idea that like actual heads, because it was like that's where their power is. That sort of idea that they were actually collecting heads.
Well, and it is stated in some of the more skeptical writing that her concept of this cult of the head was not
universal.
Yeah, it was not 100% received well.
And it's less so now.
Right. And I can come up with a number of reasons as to why, but I don't know her. I don't know her research, so I probably will read that book. It sounds interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
pretty thorough. It's large and very thorough.
I would hope. I mean, she is an academic.
Yeah.
So after they leave Anne Ross's hands, they get into the hands of Frank Hudson.
Well, they're in her hands for a while. I mean, a lot of the quote unquote
the longest amount of time.
Yeah. So I think we do have to get to why, because you're like, why are you guys talking about these like supposedly 1,800-year-old heads? No. That's not the thing.
Yeah, we should say that she was able to, she believes that they dated to being about 1,800 years old.
That is what she initially says. Correct. Based on basically art, historical, like looking at them.
Right. And then which
you can do with some objects.
You can, but I have farther on here some of the analysis that the words that she used in her analysis, and they're very questionable. She was drawing.
But I mean, that's not an impossible sort of thing. I mean, I can look at like a Maya monument and go, oh, okay, that's late classic. That's early. That's not. You can do that, just not with everything.
You can do that, and you can't do it with everything. But my biggest concern with her declaring these things like she did so quickly was A, she did it so quickly, and B, I just feel like maybe they should have recognized the material maybe a little faster. Of course, we are talking about the early 70s. Technology has developed in leaps and bounds since then. So,
well, I think we're also talking about the early 70s with other historical contexts. And again, I'm not trying to champ at the bit, but we're not just talking about some weird heads. I think we have to get to why we're talking about them.
Right. Okay.
So let's not talk about Ross yet. Let's talk about Hexham. What happens there?
Right. So after they leave Ross's hands, they get into the hands of a.
Well, no, hang on. Hey, so when they're up in Hexham, all right, let's just put it out there. Weird shit supposedly happens around them.
All right, if you want to talk about this early.
I think we have to. I think we have to, because that then guides what happens.
So when they first get discovered, the two boys, the two boys and the family that the boys belong to immediately start having strange happenings. They did hang on to the heads for a little while. And while they had hold of the heads, strange phenomena did occur. The heads supposedly moved on their own. I believe that they were the first ones to say that there was a cold aura around them.
Yeah, basically lots of poltergeist type stuff.
Right. And was Sheepman with them, or was that?
No, that's their neighbor. Okay. So the people that find it, they're living in Hexham in northern England, and the house that finds it, they then start talking about poltergeist style activity, like things moving around the house, the heads moving, like you said, cold auras, stuff like that happening. And they start to go to the press also. Well, they go to the press and the other thing occurs, and we'll talk about that. And they even say, like, one of the boys had been thinking, and they did not make these things. I don't think anybody thinks that, but one of the boys had actually made a similar looking head the day before because it had just come to him. So there's all this sort of psychic. And again, this is the early 70s. This is kind of the height of the counterculture. And frankly, I would argue, and I've actually been putting together a timeline for the book I just wrote. It's like there is a lot of people believing in stuff like this in ways they didn't before and after, like psychic stuff. It's kind of like the late Victorian era in this sense with spiritualism. So that happens. Then it's their neighbor, Nellie Dodd. She goes by a couple of names. Their neighbor says that she sees, I wouldn't say attacking, but maybe assaulting, approaching, whatever, in her house, a were-sheep, a part man, part sheep. Now, when I first read this, I assumed like werewolf, like sheep head, man body. I actually went back and reread it recently. It's the other way.
So it had a dark-haired
man's head and cloven hooves and a sheep-like shaggy body. So this sounds like it's supposed to be vaguely demonic.
That's just okay. So, but here's my thing. Here's my thing with the heads. Since we're already getting into this, and we've got only a few minutes before break.
Yes.
Why did immediately these heads start getting associated with were creatures? Like there's nothing about these heads. At least, I mean, maybe it's a cultural thing, and I don't get it. But there is nothing about these heads that would immediately make me assume werewolf. And I mean, I have a little bit of werewolf lore behind me, so I would think I would recognize that.
I don't know.
But
I don't know.
It makes no sense. I'm just like, where do you go from these two tiny little doll heads to sheep man?
Well, I think we're going to get back to that historical context, I think, a little later. But Nellie Dodd, she basically says, I don't want to live in this house anymore. Screw this. I'm out of here. You know, the house didn't literally go, get out. But a were-sheep appeared, and she's like, yep, done. I'm listening. I'm gone. I'm not starting a horror movie. And in fact, the local council, because, you know, it's like this whole council housing thing, they said, sure. Now, the reason they gave was, well, you know, the house has become too, you know, you need more room, you need more space. But apparently it was also very clear that the family was just like, we're not like hanging out with were-sheep man. That's not happening.
Were-sheep man.
With cloven hooves.
So confused. So let's go to break real quick. And when we come back,
because this is not the last were thing that's going to happen.
No, it's not. It is not. But there is an interesting tie-in to a historical event prior to this.
Yes.
But let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, we will unbury some of those leads that we tucked away
Absolutely.
Archaeology and Ale is a free monthly talk presented by Archaeology in the City from the University of Sheffield Archaeology Department. That's where the archaeology part of Archaeology and Ale comes from. As for the ale part, the talk is held upstairs at the Red Deer, a great local pub on Pitt Street in Sheffield, South Yorkshire, on the last Thursday of every month. If you're in Sheffield, do come along, and don't worry, non-ale alternatives are also available. If you can't make it to Sheffield, never fear. You can listen to the Archaeology and Ale talk every month, right here on the Archaeology Podcast Network. And now, back to the show.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
And we are back, and we just discussed Where Sheep Man and the neighbors. Where Sheep Man.
Yeah, no, so I think we just created a sci-fi channel movie. I think that just happened.
Yes.
Where Sheep Man for Shark. I mean, apparently they had a whole Sharknado week last week. But,
well, they have enough of them now.
Yeah,
There's
anyway.
like 5 of them.
Oh, God. But I saw parts of one of them. But all right, so now this has hit the press because, if a demonic Were-Sheep Man shows up in your house, you're probably going to say something to somebody. Like, that's probably going to be an issue. Well,
and interestingly, that same night in the local news, apparently there was a report of basically what turned out to be a frat boy prank of a man running around with a dead sheep draped across his shoulders who happened to also wander down that same road. So take that how you want to take it. It's just kind of weird coincidence-y.
Yeah. Yeah. Or he was astrally projecting. So,
Ooh, there you go.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like a Bigfoot thing then.
So what happens next?
So after these artifacts are then passed on, there aren't really many tales of weird things happening to the next people who came in line, the Newcastle Museum getting hold of them.
No, they do not have them, but somebody does.
Weird things don't appear to start happening until Anne Ross gets hold of these.
Exactly.
And I have a really great quote I want to read about Anne Ross receiving these because, as you will find out later, I mean, I'm sure she's a very nice person, but I so want to call bullshit on this statement. Dr. Ross remembered the strange coldness emanating from the heads and taking an instant dislike to them. She instantly concluded that they were Celtic. And that's coming off of a website from Spooky Isles talking about the Hexham heads and the werewolves. And that'll be in the show notes. But that little quote, the two books that Jeb mentioned at the beginning of the show, those seem to be the major source of information for pretty much any website out there.
Yes.
Which just shows you how good of a resource they are. So I'm assuming this quote came out of one of those two books because this author quotes both of them but doesn't cite both of them, like doesn't cite what he's taking from where. But as soon as she gets hold of them, for some reason she takes them home with her, and I'm assuming that's just so she can analyze them better.
And like I said, she was putting together sort of like a collection of other Celtic heads because she was studying this. Yeah, there's plenty of these things like shown in that book I mentioned.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned that she had her own private collection of stone heads. So she probably just wanted to take them home and research them. Because up until this point, they have been treated as if they were any other artifact on the planet. So Dr. Ross, who is a respected archaeologist, takes these things home. And then she says that night, she woke up around 2 or 3 a.m., noticing the intense chill of the bedroom and feeling that something was there. And she was alarmed to see a 6-foot-tall, half-man, half-wolf figure lurking in the door. She then follows said figure out of her room and watches it vault over the stair rail and run through the back of the house, and then she loses track of it. I just want to say, if that's real, that woman is like well adjusted, because I wouldn't, if I had seen a 6-foot anything standing at the foot of my bed in the middle of the night, I would not have chased after it.
Well, to be fair, these are the British. They do have a stiff upper lip.
Apparently.
So, yeah. So she basically runs into a friggin' werewolf in her house, a spectral werewolf. And she's not the only one. Her daughter later, according to Anne Ross, has a same kind of issue.
Yeah, it's the daughter seems to have a nearly identical, like to the point where the werewolf that her daughter saw also vaults the stair rail and runs through the back of the house. So this thing has a pattern. It's interesting though. At the
husband does not, by the way.
The husband never sees it, but according to another article, the daughter claims that she was taking food to her father who was ill one day. So she was basically taking him breakfast in bed and could not go up the stairs because the werewolf was standing at the top of the stairs and wouldn't let her pass. There's no resolution to that story, so I don't know if she just like, they're so used to it now, they're just like, hey, Bill, get off the stairs. Or if, she saw it turn around and went back to the kitchen, and when she went back the next time, the thing was gone. So I don't know how that resolved. But that again goes back to my whole, these people are really like laid back, because seriously, a werewolf standing at the top of your stairs that won't let you pass?
Yeah. Well, the thing that comes out, and Screeton talks about this, and is not the only one, is that apparently Ross had like quite a long sort of symbolic fascination or relationship with like the idea of werewolves and spiritual wolf images and things like this. Now, it doesn't mean she's, wrong or anything like that, but that seems relevant.
It just seems like there's a lot of
things going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of setup for the Hexham heads coming into Dr. Ross's possession. And not that serendipity placed these stones in her hands. It's like she got hold of these things that already had a story of a were creature attached to them.
Although I think she supposedly does not know that.
Yeah, okay. And then from there, she suddenly starts seeing werewolves, not were-sheep, but werewolves. So, it's a red flag. I mean, there's no other way to put it.
Yeah. No, there really isn't. Like I'm looking at Paul Screeton's book on page 44, and he was there researching. This is with David Clark. He's really researching material for the book, Twilight of the Celtic Gods, Clark's tape recorder, et cetera, et cetera. And the narrative here is the man who's the subject of the next chapter, members of the Ross Feacham family, petrological analysis, other stoneheads, and related weirdness she had encountered, continuous archaic Celtic survival practices in Perthshire, Scotland, personal psychism, exorcism, all sorts of stuff. I mean, basically, yeah.
No, I think it's also interesting that on David Clark's webpage or website, he talks about, now he and Anne Ross were friends.
Yes, absolutely.
So he was able to talk with her about this experience while it was occurring. And I think it's interesting when he spoke with her in 1994, he says, she told me the stones brought an evil presence with them and said, quote, there was no doubt the haunting was that of a werewolf. The thing took form very gradually. And when it actually became not just audible and hinted at, but tangible and visible, something had to be done because it was definitely growing. So is that to mean that the first few encounters, it wasn't even like physically there?
Yes, no, I think that's exactly what it means. Let's bank that. Let's come back to that topic. Because I think that's something we will definitely talk about. Because if nothing else, we've both watched the stone tape, so right. I think we'll come back to that. So this all hits the press, and once you have a well-known archaeologist talking in the press about seeing spectral werewolves in her house, because these are spectral werewolves now, that gets pressed, and eventually this all ended up on BBC. A few years after this all resolved, there was a big BBC program that millions of people saw. So this is a well-known thing. And I've talked to archaeologists who remember being terrified of this when they were kids. Like they had seen this and they're just like, oh my God. I mean, I remember stuff like that. Like the one that absolutely horrified me as a child was Orson Welles's The Man Who Saw Tomorrow, the Nostradamus thing. And there was this stuff in these creepy paintings and the future stuff about nuclear war and cannibalism that just, I remember freaking me out. So I totally get it. I'm not blaming anybody. But so this gets in the press. Now, meanwhile, slices have been taken from the head for analysis. The first analysis concludes that they are, in fact, sandstone.
Well, there's two analyses that were done. The first one was done at Ann Ross's
basically visually. Basically visual.
Yes, it was, but it's important that people understand that this first analysis was done under a microscope, and it was done visually. The man who did it was a geologist, but
yes,
I'm saying they're both geologists, but I'm saying that the tools were limited, and I mean, it's not unthinkable that he came up with the conclusion that it was indeed limestone, or sandstone, and that it was possibly local. Later, once technology got caught up,
well, this was within a year, so I don't think, or a year or so.
What happens in a year?
It's not like right, but I don't think it's a tech thing. I think it's just that more tech got applied.
Well, yeah, there you go. But yeah, and so that at that point, the second analysis, they actually took samples from the heads themselves and were able to do a much more thorough analysis of the material. And that is when they find out that this is basically cement made out of what looks to be beach sand and lime.
Right. Yeah, and Screeton makes a big deal in the book about how like permission was not given to slice them, and apparently they took huge chunks, and kind of is trying to say that the scientist that did that work was callous, maybe not wrong, but callous. At which point,
I read the analysis. It's posted on one of the links that I'll put in here, but it didn't seem unreasonable to me. I mean, maybe in British terms it is, but as far as like to my American eye, it didn't look that weird.
Well, I think the reality is that nobody wanted this to be the answer. Now, the thing that happens is these results, there's also arguments that he like had withheld the results until something else happens. And the thing that happens is this guy by the name of Desmond Craigie, Des Craigie from Hexham, shows up and says, I used to live in that house.
Right.
And I used to work with a company that made concrete and other materials for construction. Mm-hmm. And in I want to say 56, basically 15 years earlier, I made these for my kids. And remember what we said? They look like dolls? For dolls' heads.
Yeah. And he said that he
lost or whatever.
Yeah. He said he had originally made 3 and that one of them was apparently broken. Those were his words. Apparently one got lost, and that his daughters enjoyed playing with these out in the yard. So it's these are what they look like they are. They're doll heads made out of cement.
And so, of course, the first thing that people said, and I think even Ann Ross very much said, this is like, well, that's interesting. I'd love to see Mr. Craigie make some. And then he got in the kitchen sink and did.
Yeah. And made them from scratch at home.
Yeah. And then the results came out, the second analysis, that in fact, they were exactly what he was saying they were. Right. And he did live there. He really did live in that house. So at that point, Ross actually had to basically say, well, maybe they're not that old.
Yeah, so Ross has to start walking back her story, which is interesting to me because this is where all of the spooky stuff has to now be accounted for, because these are no longer ancient artifacts. Now they're very modern artifacts because the gentleman lived there in like the 1950s, I believe. So 20 years before these were even found.
Now, let's be clear. Not everybody who studies this, because, we've talked about people who talk about Babylonian Stargate, so this is not a surprise, but not everybody who studies this agrees with that. I think most people, even that believe there's a supernatural or paranormal component here, do accept, because also they've seen pictures of them. They're like, yeah, for frick's sake.
Yeah.
They do accept that they're modern, but there are a few people who don't. But again, there are people who believe in the flat earth. So fine, whatever. I just wanted to put that out there. That's all I'm saying.
It's interesting how once these become basically undeniably modern, that Ross starts coming up with a new hypothesis as to why the paranormal activity occurs around these stones. And she's helped out with the...
Does Ross say that? Because I know some other people do. I can't remember if she did. That's a legit question. That's not like a leading. I actually don't remember if she got on board with these other ideas. Does she?
Let me check my sources here, but I do believe that she says at one point, it doesn't really matter where they came from. The effects that they have are real.
Well, that's definitely the opinion of a number of people. And one person, this is another book that I would not recommend as highly, simply because if nothing else, this also did cover, there's basically a chapter on it, but this was another person who was involved. She gives them to Don Robbins.
Okay,
now, Don Robbins is a chemist. It's called The Secret Language of Stone.
Right.
And he very much pushes this idea called the stone tape theory. Now, Robbins is involved at this point with folks like Paul Devereaux, who still works on stuff like this with Spirit Roads. But with this idea, there's this idea that's percolating and becoming very popular around this time. And many have argued that archaeologists like Apostate, TC Tom Lethbridge, who we can talk about, pushes this idea that material objects, and especially stone, with crystals and lattices and other things that are difficult sometimes to describe, because I think that's really what's going on here. It's kind of like this is sort of like the early version of like quantum can do anything.
Right.
So I think it is I think it's not unrelated. That stone, crystal, lattice works, or other kinds of material objects can record electromagnetic information. Now, remember, this is before, really for almost anybody alive at this time, this is basically before laser discs. This is before CDs. This is before computer discs in any real way. We think, they are early ones are magnetic and some are magnetic today. So really, most recording of data at this time that's not unlike vinyl is on magnetic tape.
Yeah, like I said, it makes a lot of sense that they're saying that the stones are taped because... So one of the things that people have to remember is my dad was in the tech industry at this time, and when it came to computers and storing data, the best, and I don't know if it was the only way, but the best way to store data at that time was on magnetic tape. And
it was certainly the most common. It was definitely like that was what it did. Yeah.
And I remember my dad bringing the tapes home, and they were slightly smaller than a VHS tape. I mean, they looked like giant tapes. And
computers had those reels. I mean, they had, like, if you think of like 1960s computers, they had reels of tape.
Right. I mean, and they're not joking. When you taped something, you were literally putting it on magnetic tape.
Right.
And so that's why this concept of stone tapes is not odd to me. Like the whole where it came from doesn't seem that strange to me, though it may seem strange to people today, where we've got like MP4s and most people don't even know what a tape is.
There is a remnant in paranormalia today in ghost hunting. When people talk about EVPs, many of them argue that the best way to get them is with old taping rather than modern digital. And you might argue, well, that's because old taping has like distortion. But I actually think that's why, because that's, I think, where the idea comes from.
Right. And I don't think people understand the distortion that can happen on the maybe not to data. I would have to ask my dad, and that's not possible. But I do know with sound and with audio, I mean, all you have to do is watch a VHS tape or listen to an actual old tape to hear the difference in the sound quality. And it's that fuzzy sound that everybody gets their ghost talk from.
Right. But that's not what we're talking about here. So basically, let's do a quick intro to this and we'll pick it up. What we're talking about here is, in essence, imagine that you're in almost anywhere, and especially stone, because there's a lot of like sort of quartz and crystalline structures in,
and it's especially quartz and crystal.
Yeah. Which, again, remember, quartz is in radios. And so there's this whole idea that quartz is associated with technology and crystals. And so basically, and we'll pick this up, but the idea here is that if you want ghostly apparitions, but you're not tying it into a very explicitly, and let's frankly say it, religious perspective of souls and all of that, one other option would be that the world around you is, in essence, recording information, and that possibly under circumstances or certain sensitive individuals, that information could be played back. So if you go to a castle on the windswept moors It's not the spirit of some poor maid who was murdered by an evil lord who's running across the moor. It's the fact that when she did that at a very emotionally stressful point in her life, that was recorded by the rocks around her, and you can potentially pick it up if you have, in essence, the sort of the right frequency. And that's basically the stone tape idea.
All right, so let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, we will try to talk more about the connection between the Hexham heads and these werewolves.
The Archaeology Podcast Network's conference channel is a collection of interviews from conferences around the world. Interviews are usually posted during the conference with minimal editing, so you, the listener, can be there virtually. Check out the conference feed at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/conferences. Now let's get back to the show.
Are you ready to launch your career to new heights? Visit careers.dish.com/technician now and uncover a world of exciting opportunities waiting just for you. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, Dish has everything you need to thrive. Don't wait any longer to kickstart your next opportunity. Apply today and join the Dish family where innovation meets opportunity. Visit us online at careers.dish.com/technician. Your future starts now.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
And we are back, and we went out talking about the stone tapes. I'd like to talk about those a little bit more, though, because it's kind of an interesting, kind of complicated, kind of simplistic idea.
It's a very interesting idea. So just to reiterate, it's the idea that stone in particular, because of quartz and crystals, and this gets into all these sort of quote unquote new age crystal ideas, collects energy. And I have to admit, when I explain thermoluminescence to my students, in which electrons are collected in the sort of crystalline lattice of pottery and then released, it does come to mind, but it's not the same thing. Not werewolves in the pottery. That would be terrifying. But no, it's the idea that rather than ghostly apparitions, and we'll talk about Margaret Murray on a future podcast, but she thought it had something to do with the moisture in the atmosphere, but she had a similar idea. But people like T.C. Lethbridge, who was an archaeologist, and others were arguing that ghostly apparitions were, in essence, not unlike a video or audio recording on a tape, but the tape was the stones around us.
Especially in the higher the quartz content of the stone, the better the stone would record.
Right. And then they're getting played back either in special circumstances or to special people who have more ability to pick up the sort of strange and unusual and psychic. So that gets into the whole psychic thing. So in essence, it's kind of like, it reminds me to some degree of how people want to have things like psychic abilities and angels and stuff like that. But rather than just say that, they say words like quantum. You know, it's an earlier version. It's magnetic. And there's a dissertation, I don't have it at hand, that's turned into a book. I think it's on Wonder Shows. It basically talks about the same idea, how electricity was treated the same way, even into the early 20th century. The electricity was almost supernatural. And then radio, people in the era of late spiritualism, made numerous analogies to radio. And UFOs are like this, where we use the technology of our day, and it becomes the sort of way we speak about what would otherwise be called the supernatural.
So to tie all this together so far,
yes.
So the reason that we're talking about these stone tapes is because earlier we mentioned that these Hexham heads were basically debunked.
Debunked as being from the Iron Age.
Right. These Hexham heads are clearly no longer ancient. They're not 1,800 years old. They're like 20 at this point. I mean, they're very young.
Yeah. So if you've got a ghost story, if you've got a werewolf associated with them, and they're not from like an Iron Age chieftain's, horde, well, then where does the spectral, creepy, folkloric werewolf come from if it's not an 1,800-year-old ghost? Right.
So the theory that then got bantered around was that everyone's belief who have been around these stones, everyone has believed in the were-sheep and the were-man to the point where they have now imprinted upon these stone heads the image or the vestige of this werewolf.
Well, what this starts to get into is there's this word that right around the time we're talking about, the word had been in the Western occult tradition before this, but right in the late 60s and early 70s, people like John Keel from the Mothman Prophecies and others are pushing the concept into paranormal circles and occult circles of, well, a version of the tulpa. Now, the tulpa is this, and I can't explain it fully. In fact, if you want to hear more about this, there is a really great episode, and this is actually the second time I've referenced them. It's not like we're in competition in any real sense, so yes, I don't think there's anything with this. Are we?
Yes.
Yes. Are we? So we can't mention them?
I don't know. No, we can mention them. All right, they just need to know that they are my nemesis. Anyway.
I don't know. But the podcast Monster Talk that is primarily the brainchild of Blake Smith, and they had an episode about this idea of tulpas, and it was Joseph Laycock, and I'm looking for who was the other Natalia Mickles, and they did a thing on Slender Man and tulpas, and so this idea. In modern paranormal circles, you hear people bandy about, and John Keel was the big one. Many others have since, that this idea of thought forms that supposedly comes from Tibetan Buddhism, that if you go and you think hard enough and you do proper rituals, you can basically create a thing, a spectral presence. And this has been on the X-Files. This is very much in pop culture now. That has a life of its own. That you can sort of whistle semi-solid things into existence. The problem is, and what they describe very nicely on that podcast, is that that's not really what tulpa means in Tibetan Buddhism.
Right.
And really what that is taking people like Alexander David Neal, who was a spiritualist or really a theosophist, who went and were some of the first people that introduced and popularized Buddhism in the West. We're taking these ideas from outside cultures and more or less warping them into stuff that already existed, like elemental spirits in the Western occult tradition of the Victorians and later. But today you will find many people who are like, are UFOs really UFOs? Are they really like alien spaceship or something else? Or are we creating them with our minds?
Right. And this is something that Ken and
not just in our minds, but like actually creating them in the real world with our minds.
Right. And like I was saying, this is something that Ken and I and you and I have talked about, how the slow change from aliens being a physical manifestation into a mental or a non-corporeal manifestation. And
what Sharon Hill on our show talked about as supernatural creep. And we've talked a lot about that.
Right. And it's basically what's happening here. Once it becomes apparent that the heads themselves cannot be the true source of these werewolves, these spectral werewolves, there has to be another reason for them. And so now it's not the heads themselves.
They become like spiritual foci.
Right. It's the energy that has been imprinted by the modern people, the people who have had contact with them. The problem with this is where does the were-sheep come from?
Well, I don't know. Well, the thing is, as much as we may make fun of it as a were-sheep, the fact that it's a person with cloven hooves, that screams folkloric devil and demon to me.
Right. And it's just, I mean, it's kind of odd to me that the neighbor would have a nightmare. And so therefore it must somehow be connected to these two little heads that have nothing to indicate anything about them.
Well, I think the fact that they started getting attributed to the quote unquote Celts. Now, we've talked about this a bit, but there is very much from the 19th century, and even before that, but definitely in the 19th century with the Celtic revival, with people like W.B. Yeats, members of the Golden Dawn, all these folks who are Andrew Lang, who are pushing these notions of the Celts being, first of all, a Celt was associated with the French and other folks, but it becomes associated in the 19th century with what's called the Celtic fringe: Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Manx, other parts of the British Empire that are not basically English, which, if you've been paying attention recently to Brexit, all this stuff has become a hell of a lot more relevant recently.
Right.
And these are people that were pushing for a revival of people who had very much been oppressed by imperial and colonial policies in the early modern era and the late medieval era. So you start to see in the Romantic era, just as other people are creating folklore to create national identity. I mean, the Grimm brothers weren't just going out to get fun tales of Snow White for Disney to turn into a multi-billion-dollar industry. They were trying to record what they believed were the last pagan survivals from before Christianity and then modernity kind of like drained the magic out of the landscape. And the same thing's happening with the Celtic revival. And so they're going around and they're collecting all this folklore, some of which is not that old. They thought it was, but it isn't. We're gonna revisit that concept later in another show. But what happens is, and we talked about this with sort of the collapse proto-history and myth thing a few episodes ago with hyperdiffusion. These things on the edge of history get a mythic quality. And if you say Celtic today, that inherently brings images of like magic and druids and mystery and sort of like antiquity and all of that with it, when in reality, the best Celtic really largely means is a linguistic component and kind of a name that some Romans and Greeks stuck on some Iron Age folks to the north. But it becomes sort of a placeholder for ancestral, mythic past. And so the fact that you would have something very folkloric, werewolves, demons, all these sorts of things appearing, and then somebody associating them with something of the ancestral, mythic, spooky past, I don't think is actually as surprising. What we would perhaps do that with in the US would be, oh, is your house haunted? Well, is it on a Native American burial ground? Now, that whole idea is largely 20th century, not entirely, and largely a Western obsession, but that would be the closest analogy I could think of.
Right. And it's interesting, the similarities between that and the things that occur here in the States when it comes to indigenous identity and the whole trying to maintain a cultural identity through oral myths and history.
Yeah. Again, though, a lot of this comes from people who were diving into this and then taking in and using pieces to kind of create this notion.
Right.
Yeah. Again,
well,
like,
it's the
like
same.
Yates.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, it's the same thing that Ken and I have talked about. People who send in their 23andMe and find out that they've got quote unquote Native American genes. And it's like, what does that even mean? But now these people are surrounding themselves with things picked up from all across the nation because now they're Native American. And it's like, you've got stuff from like 40 different tribes here. Pick one.
Well, these folks are definitely Irish, but whether that has anything to do with standing stones and wicker men and other kinds of things, see, that's the issue. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's not unrelated.
They're picking up pieces that they like, and they're, for whatever reason,
which is how we all create identity. We all create
exactly, and they're using them to recreate a modern identity.
Yeah.
And I just like the whole werewolf thing. Like, I'm still stuck on how the frick the werewolf is connected to these two stone heads. I'm just like, and I don't mean like the spiritual power part of that. I get that.
Why werewolf? Well, it's weird.
Why werewolf?
I think that, I mean, you've heard me argue this, so maybe I got a bias, but I'm like, it's archaeological, therefore it's weird. To a lot of people, that's an equation that makes sense.
Why not like fossilized fairies? I mean, that would have made a whole lot more. That's what I thought we were going to be talking about when I first saw Hexham heads, and I saw the first pictures, and I'm like, they think they're fairies or they're goblins or something.
No, it's so much weirder than that.
And now I'm like, these aren't even like, it's not even like they look like werewolves. They look like apple dolls.
We'll leave the fossilized fairies to Jaime Maussan, which that just comes from the recent news, but we won't get into that. But yeah, no, it is very weird. And again, I can think of other things. I mean, why would there be like so let's take it here. Let's give the example. Let's move it here. We've talked about Amityville a little earlier, or not earlier.
Amityville.
Yeah. And so Amityville, the people who Some have said made it up. Others have not. I'm trying to legally cover things.
The story of Amityville.
In the Amityville Horror, they talk about, it's a Shinnecock, not burial ground, but a place where they left their mentally ill people. What does that have to do with fairly clearly demonic, including like Lord of the Flies, like fly? What does that have to do with any of that? But it's like, supposedly indigenous, archaeological. Okay, now we got like weird demonic things. It's kind of the same equation. It's kind of the same thing.
I guess I just don't equate werewolves with demons, and I guess I should, and maybe that's where I'm having the disconnect.
Werewolves, yeah, I think that's the thing, is that a lot of people today, they think of werewolves, the 1940 movie, the Wolfman, turning it into like a curse, and the idea that it's sort of like almost a viral thing, like Dracula, when in reality, the vast majority, basically, if you go back to the early modern era, werewolves are more or less the same thing as witches. Like you would go on, there were werewolf trials. You could turn yourself into a werewolf by doing like sort of satanic rituals. It's much more like witchcraft, really, and shape-shifting than, I've been bitten and I have a saliva. And yeah, that's a later kind of take on the werewolf.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's my problem. I'm more familiar with modern werewolf lore than this really ancient werewolf lore.
Yeah, like stuff from like 300-400 years ago is really more the idea of it being sort of demonic. So one thing I did want to talk about the stone tape thing is I found online the movie, the television show. I think it was in 1972, December, because it was for Christmas. Because there is a history of making ghost stories and think Christmas Carol in English culture at Christmas time. There was a movie called The Stone Tape that's taken from this, and this popularized this. And this is written by Nigel Neal. Nigel Neal is a fantastic screenwriter. And on another episode, not this one, we should definitely talk about Quatermass in the Pit. You should watch it. Everybody should watch it. It's awesome. There's a mini series, and then the 1960s Hammer one is probably the best, other than maybe the Call of Cthulhu, the best ancient alien story. But in the Stone Tape, so you watched it, I watched it. They basically take this idea and play with it.
Right. And it's really a very good movie. Yeah. Even as old as it is, it's still a good spooky movie that I think you will enjoy if you watch it.
Yeah, and it is right around this same time, and all this stuff is in the air. And remember, this is after the Summer of Love. It's after 1968. There's a lot of this is when, and you guys talked about this with Colavito, and we may talk about this again in the future. This is when like Eric Von Daniken is a huge hit, and like Rod Serling is kind of creating In Search Of on American television. Paranormal things were actually a lot more acceptable. We talked in a recent episode about the different documentaries and how it's one thing if you have like basically on Animal Planet hunting Bigfoot for the quote unquote rubes, but everybody got really angry when they did that on Discovery Channel for basically like the sophisticated folk, and that's when they bit themselves with that megalodon thing. It was okay to talk about this stuff in those quote unquote, and I'm using this in a very ironic sense, more sophisticated kind of places in the early 70s in ways that it may or may not be now.
Right, it was more popular. It was more popular, and it almost seemed like it was more feasible back then. Like, I don't know. I guess maybe we hadn't all become curmudgeons yet, and it was still fun as a group to sit around and talk about basically fairies. It was a revival of the spiritualism movement.
Well, and again, if you read Twilight of the Celtic Gods by David Clark and Andy Roberts, you will get tons of that flavor into the 90s. I think the thing, and we've talked about this, and we're kind of wrapping up here, but I think the thing that really changes it is when that gets tied into nasty, dark, conspiratorial places.
Right, and like the bad things that happened in the 80s.
Yeah, and none of that's happened yet. It starts to happen in the 1970s with the Satanic Panic and post-Watergate and all these things. But you're in this kind of like, hey, light and Glastonbury and crystals, and it's all
It's still fun.
okay.
Yeah.
And a lot of that survived. Like if you we'll talk about this another time, and I've talked about it before, but you go to Glastonbury, that's kind of the feeling you get. Like this is all positive things.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the stuff that we cover is about, it often does get tied into kind of like nasty, like you're all awful and you're hiding the truth and giants are real and they're Nephilim with like negative rhesus blood, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And I'm like, just shut up. I kind of just I want to say that sometimes. So yeah, this is, and I think the sum up, like my 30-second sum up is, the fact that archaeologists were getting drawn into this means that they're part of their same culture. There have been studies showing that explanations for the classic Maya collapse very much follow concerns in the news about war, climate change, other sorts of things. It doesn't mean that those people's science is necessarily bad. It means that they're drawing from their cultural environment because, after all, they are human.
Well, and this is something that we harp on a lot on the show, is being aware of your natural biases.
Yeah.
You are biased, period. End of discussion. I am biased, and that's just how it is.
Yeah.
The difference is I like to think I'm aware of most of my biases, and so I try to work around them. And I am aware overall that I am biased, which makes me second guess everything that I do. That's good science.
Right,
science
exactly.
is nothing if not doubt. And if you don't doubt things, then you're doing it wrong.
Exactly. And that's why we make such a big deal about this. So my final thought on this is, when we talk about peer review, when we talk about literature, when we talk about checking our own crap and saying, hey, you know what, maybe I was wrong. That's not, us like imposing alien rules on people. That's basically saying, hey, you know what, I know I can be wrong. That's why I send this to people who tear it apart, because I don't want to be wrong on the record. I'd like to not be, but it's not always perfect. And I think when we look at Anne Ross and at the other things that are going on, at the end of the day, we're anthropologists. We understand the power of culture.
Right. And we also understand the power of getting sucked in and drinking your own Kool-Aid. So
now I'm just hoping that I'm not cursed by spectral werewolves tonight. That's all I'm asking.
Well, if I haven't been cursed by the crystal skulls yet, I don't think I'm going to get caught by the Hexham heads. But Jeb, thank you. Mm-hmm.
I drank my crystal heads, my crystal skulls.
How was it?
Well,
was it good?
Recently. It's been a while.
Oh, okay. Well, never mind.
It's very smooth. So
that's fun.
Yeah.
All
right.
See.
We'll talk about some other spooky things in the future.
Right. Thank you, Jeb, for joining me, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
As one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher, and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archaeofantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeofantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals. That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.